Keanu Reeves stepped quietly into the opulent Aurora restaurant, his faded jeans and scuffed boots a stark contrast to the glittering chandeliers and designer-clad elite around him. A smug waiter named Michael sized him up with blatant disdain, his arrogance practically dripping from every word. What happened next would not only leave the entire dining room speechless, but it would also turn Michael's world upside down in ways no one could predict. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Aurora, nestled in the heart of Beverly Hills, was a shrine to wealth and exclusivity. Its polished elegance buzzed with the presence of Hollywood moguls, socialites, and tycoons, all draped in designer clothing. Conversations floated through the air like a symphony of power plays and name-dropping. Aurora wasn't just a place to eat, it was a stage where status was performed, and Keanu, with his unassuming demeanor, looked like an interloper in a world that worshipped appearances. Michael, one of Aurora's most senior waiters, spotted him instantly. Freshly promoted to shift manager, Michael thrived on his newfound authority, seeing himself as the gatekeeper of Aurora's sacred hierarchy. To him, this wasn't just a restaurant, it was a battlefield where he could crush those he deemed unworthy. Michael prided himself on his ability to read people, categorizing them by their clothes, posture, and aura. In his eyes, Keanu, with his threadbare jacket and unkempt hair, was nothing but a trespasser. His lips curled into a sneer as he leaned toward a junior waiter, David, who stood nearby. "Look at this," Michael muttered, his voice low but dripping with disdain. "Another nobody who thinks he can just waltz in here." David, a nervous young man still finding his footing, glanced at Keanu and shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe he's just here to eat," he offered weakly, but Michael waved him off. "Eat?" Michael scoffed. "People like him come to gawk, not to dine. Watch me handle this." With the confidence of a predator, Michael adjusted his pristine uniform, smoothed his slicked back hair, and strode toward Keanu, who was calmly scanning the menu at the front desk. There was a stillness in Keanu's posture, a quiet confidence that didn't match his appearance. But Michael, blinded by arrogance, saw only a target. Clearing his throat loudly enough to draw the attention of nearby patrons, Michael planted himself in front of Keanu, arms crossed, his smile as fake as the politeness in his voice. "Good evening, sir," he began, tone syrupy sweet but laced with venom. "Are you lost?" Keanu tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting Michael's with a flicker of amusement. "No," he replied, voice steady and low. "I'm here for dinner." Michael's eyes narrowed. Oh, and he narrowed, his amusement replaced by irritation at Keanu's calmness. "Dinner?" he repeated, dragging out the word. "I see. Well, Aurora is an exclusive establishment. We cater to a very specific clientele. Are you sure this is where you want to be?" Keanu's lips curved into a small, knowing smile, but his tone remained even. "Pretty sure, unless you're suggesting I'm not welcome." The directness caught Michael off guard, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, not at all," Michael said, voice openly condescending. "But let's be honest, sir, this isn't exactly the kind of place where people in—" He paused, letting his gaze rake over Keanu's worn clothes. "Your kind of attire typically dine. We have standards, you see." Keanu raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Standards?" he echoed, a hint of challenge in his tone. "And those standards are based on what exactly? The price tag on my jacket?" Michael bristled, his facade of politeness slipping. "About presentation," Michael snapped, his voice rising just enough to draw more eyes. "This is Aurora, not some dive bar. Our guests expect a certain level of class. Something you clearly don't understand." Keanu's smile didn't waver, but his eyes sharpened, a quiet intensity settling in his gaze. "Class," he said, his voice low but cutting. "Interesting word. I always thought class was about how you treat people, not how much you spend on your shoes. But maybe I've got it wrong." The retort hit Michael like a slap, and for a moment his composure faltered. A few patrons nearby turned their heads, some smirking at the exchange, others whispering to their companions. Michael, sensing the attention, doubled down, his voice now dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, I'm sure you're an expert on class," he sneered, eyes glinting with malice. But let me give you a tip, sir. If you're going to play the philosopher, do it somewhere that doesn't charge $500 for a steak. You're out of your league here. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but every word deliberate. And you're out of line, he said, calm, but with an edge that made Michael blink. I asked for a table, not a lecture. Can you manage that, or should I speak to someone who can? The challenge hung in the air, thick and electric. Michael's face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. But he refused to back down. Fine, he hissed, voice low to avoid further attention. If you insist on embarrassing yourself, that's your choice. He glanced at the reservation list on his tablet, not even bothering to check it properly, and tapped the screen with exaggerated flair. After a few seconds of dramatic silence, he sighed theatrically. Well, as I suspected, you don't have a reservation. That's okay, Keanu replied, still unruffled. I don't mind waiting. Michael's irritation flared into full-blown anger. This man wasn't flustered, wasn't making excuses, wasn't behaving like the intruder Michael wanted him to be. Waiting? Michael repeated, his voice now openly mocking. Sir, just so you know, we have a strict dress code. Jackets, tailored suits, elegant evening wear. He paused, letting his gaze linger on Keanu's scuffed boots. You're a little underdressed for our usual guests. I'm not sure waiting will change that. Nearby, a couple overheard the exchange. The man, dressed in a bespoke suit, and the woman, shimmering in a gold gown, smirked, casting sideways glances at Keanu. The woman whispered something to her partner, both chuckling under their breath. Keanu remained unshaken. I'm comfortable with what I'm wearing, he said evenly, his smile unwavering. And I'm pretty sure your dress code doesn't trump basic hospitality. So, about that table? Michael let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, shaking his head. Oh, you're a real piece of work, he said, his voice now loud enough to turn more heads. Okay then, if you insist on making a fool of yourself, be my guest. Far from the elegance of the main dining room, Keanu didn't seem to mind his cramped, dimly lit table near Aurora's kitchen doors. He picked up the menu, scanning the fine print with a focus that suggested he was oblivious to the indignity of his seating, or perhaps that he simply didn't care. Across the room, Michael watched him with a mix of amusement and disdain, waiting for the moment Keanu would realize his mistake and slink away. In Michael's experience, men like this, those who dared to step into Aurora in worn-out clothes thinking they could belong, never lasted long. Michael smirked and leaned toward David, the junior waiter wiping down a nearby table. He's just stalling, Michael whispered, his voice dripping with mockery. Give it 5 minutes tops. He'll see the prices in bolt. But 5 minutes passed, then 10. Keanu remained seated, unfazed. Michael's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Determined to regaining control, Michael grabbed a pitcher of ice water from a side station and strode toward Keanu's table. His movements deliberate, his intent clear. As he approached, he accidentally tilted the pitcher, sending a cascade of frigid water splashing onto Keanu's lap. The liquid soaked through his jeans, pooling on the floor. A few nearby patrons gasped, their heads turning to watch the scene unfold. Oops, Michael said, his voice dripping with false contrition. My apologies, sir. These things happen when we're busy serving our real guests. He set the pitcher down on the table with a loud clink, his eyes glinting with malice. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere drier. Keanu looked down at his soaked clothes, then up at Michael, his expression still maddeningly calm. He picked up a napkin, dabbing at the water with deliberate slowness. No harm done, he said. Accidents happen. Though I'm starting to think this one wasn't so accidental. Michael's face flushed with anger, but he forced a tight smile. Oh, I assure you, sir, it was, he said, his tone now openly hostile. But let's be honest, you don't belong here. Why don't you do us all a favor and leave before you embarrass yourself further? The exchange drew more attention. At a nearby table, Vincent and Emily, a wealthy couple who had arrived earlier, exchanged glances. Vincent, a man accustomed to getting his way, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. The waiter's got a point, he muttered to Emily. This place isn't for riffraff. If you can't dress the part, you shouldn't play the game. Emily frowned, her sapphire gown shimmering as she shifted uncomfortably. He's been nothing but polite, she whispered back. The waiter's the one making a scene. At another table, Christopher, an older businessman with silver hair and a navy suit, observed the situation with quiet interest. Unlike Vincent, his expression was one of disapproval. Meanwhile, Keanu met Michael's glare with a steady gaze of his own. "Embarrass myself?" he echoed, his voice low but carrying quiet authority. "I'm just trying to have dinner. You're the one turning this into a spectacle. Maybe you should focus on doing your job instead of playing gatekeeper." Michael's smile vanished, replaced by a snarl. "My job," he hissed, leaning in closer, "is to protect this restaurant's reputation. Letting someone like you sit here, soaking wet and dressed like a hobo, is bad for business. So I'll ask you one more time. Leave, or I'll have security escort you out." The threat hung in the air, thick and heavy. The dining room fell silent, every eye now on the confrontation. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the table, his demeanor still unshaken. "Security, huh?" he said, his tone almost amused. "That's a bold move. But before you make that call, let me ask you something. What exactly makes you think I don't belong here? Is it the jeans, the boots, or is it just that I don't kiss up to people like you?" Michael's face turned a deeper shade of red, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he snapped, his voice loud enough to echo through the room. "But clever doesn't pay for a $350 steak, and it doesn't make you one of us. So get up, get out, and don't waste my time." At that moment, Christopher set his wineglass down with a deliberate clink, the sound cutting through the tension. "Young man," he said, his voice calm but commanding. His voice was deep and measured as he addressed Michael. "I think you've made your point. Perhaps you should let the gentleman eat in peace." Michael whirled around, anger now directed at Christopher. "With all due respect, sir," he said, his tone barely civil, "this is my section, and I decide who gets to eat here. If you have a problem with that, take it up with the manager." Christopher raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Oh, I might just do that," he said, his voice carrying a quiet threat. But Michael, too caught up in his own ego, ignored the warning and turned back to Keanu. "Last chance," Michael said, his voice low and menacing. "Leave, or I'll make sure you regret ever stepping foot in here." Keanu, still seated, picked up the menu again, flipping it open as if the confrontation were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Noted," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I think I'll stay, and while you're here, why don't you take my order? I'm ready to decide." Michael let out an incredulous laugh, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "Fine. If you want to play this game, let's play." He snatched the menu from Keanu's hands, flipping it closed with a sharp snap. "But don't say I didn't warn you when the bill comes. And just so we're clear, our restaurant has a 20% minimum tipping policy. Keep that in mind, if you can even afford it." Keanu's eyes met Michael's, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. "I appreciate the reminder," he said, his tone now carrying a faint edge. "Now, about that order, I'll have the foie gras rossini, $350 per plate." Michael nearly choked, his smugness faltering for the first time. "Excuse me?" he said, blinking rapidly. "You do realize that dish is $350, right? I just want to make sure there are no surprises when the bill arrives." Keanu nodded, his smile returning, but this time it carried a hint of steel. "I'm aware," he said. "It sounds wonderful. And while you're at it, maybe bring me a fresh napkin. I seem to have gotten a little wet." The jab landed and Michael's face twisted with fury. "Fine," he spat, scribbling the order down with an unnecessary flourish. "But don't expect me to hold your hand through this. You're on your own." He turned on his heel, storming off toward the kitchen, but not before muttering loudly enough for others to hear. "He'll be out of here as soon as he sees the check. Just watch." As Michael disappeared, Emily leaned toward Vincent, her voice low but firm. "That waiter is awful," she said. "That man has been nothing but polite, and he keeps trying to humiliate him." Vincent shrugged, still smirking. "If he can't handle the heat, he shouldn't be in the kitchen," he said. But his tone lacked conviction, as if he were starting to question his own stance. Across the dining room, Christopher raised his wineglass in Keanu's direction, a subtle show of support. Keanu responded with a slight nod, a soft smile playing on his lips. Michael, oblivious to the shifting tide, was already plotting his next move, determined to see Keanu humiliated. But what he didn't realize was that the night was far from over, and the man he had underestimated was about to turn the tables in ways he could never imagine. Anticipation hung thick in the air as Michael placed the leather checkbook in front of Keanu, tapping it twice, his voice dripping with false politeness. "I hope everything was to your liking," he sneered, barely containing his smirk. "And, just so we're clear, gratuity isn't included. We expect a minimum of 20%, assuming you can manage that." A hush settled over the nearby patrons, their curiosity piqued. Michael's smugness was almost tangible, and for a moment it seemed like he had won. But then Keanu calmly picked up the checkbook, opened it, and reached into his jacket, pulling out a sleek, jet-black card. The air shifted instantly. Michael's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he caught a glimpse of the card's embossed logo, a design reserved for the ultra-wealthy, the kind of card that didn't just open doors but owned them. "Wait, is that—" Michael stammered, but before he could finish, Robert appeared beside him. The manager's expression was tight, his posture rigid. "Mr. Reeves," Robert said, his voice carrying a mix of deference and urgency. "My sincerest apologies, sir." The words hit Michael like a freight train. His stomach dropped, palms clammy. "Reeves? No way!" But the confirmation came when Robert bowed slightly, his face etched with an anxious smile. "We had no idea you were dining with us tonight. Please allow me to personally handle your check. Your meal, of course, is complimentary." The restaurant fell silent. The clink of silverware and hum of conversation vanished, replaced by gasps and frantic whispers. Vincent and Emily exchanged stunned looks, Emily's earlier disapproval of Michael now fully vindicated. Christopher, the older businessman, nodded knowingly, a faint smile on his lips. Michael, however, stood frozen, his once arrogant demeanor crumbling into dust. He had been mocking, belittling, and humiliating one of Aurora's owners. Keanu closed the checkbook calmly, then looked up at Michael, his gaze unreadable. "No need for that," he said to Robert, his voice steady. "I'd prefer to pay." Turning his attention back to Michael, Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly. "But before we do that, I think we need to have a conversation." The silence grew suffocating. Every guest, waiter, and bartender watched, unmoving. Michael opened his mouth, but no words came. Keanu leaned forward, his voice low but carrying a quiet authority. "Tell me, Michael, what made you think I didn't belong here?" Michael swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know," he stammered, his eyes darting around, seeking an escape. "Didn't know what?" Keanu pressed. "That I was one of the owners? That I had money? Or that I was worthy of being here?" Michael's face burned. I thought," he began, but Keanu cut him off. "You thought you could decide who belongs based on what they wear, how they look. True class isn't about a suit or a bank account. It's about respect. And tonight you showed none." Robert's patience ran out. "Michael, I think you owe Mr. Reeves an explanation." Keanu raised a hand, silencing the room. "Actually, Robert," he said, a playful edge creeping into his tone, "I have a better idea. Let's put Michael to the test. He'll serve a group of guests I've invited. People who, by his standards, probably don't belong either. 1 hour. If he can do that respectfully, he keeps his job. If not, he's out." Keanu's smile returned, sharp and knowing. "Game on." Carrying a hint of steel, Keanu leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but his words sharp. "Consider it a lesson in humility, or if you prefer, a chance to prove me wrong. The clock starts when they walk in." Robert nodded, his expression grim. "You heard Mr. Reeves," he said to Michael. "I suggest you prepare yourself." The room buzzed with whispers, the tension palpable. Vincent leaned toward Emily, his earlier smugness replaced by unease. "This is going to be interesting," he muttered. Emily, however, smiled faintly. "It's exactly what he deserves," she whispered back. Christopher, still seated, raised his wineglass slightly, his eyes twinkling with approval. Michael, his face pale and his hands trembling, turned to Keanu, searching for a way out but finding none. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth, his voice barely audible. "I'll do it." Keanu nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good, Bim," he said. "Let's see if you can learn something tonight." As he sat back down, the restaurant braced itself for what was to come, the night now teetering on the edge of chaos and revelation. The dining room of Aurora buzzed with nervous energy as Michael stood stiffly near the front desk, his jaw clenched and his palms sweaty. The 10 minutes Keanu had given him felt like an eternity, but the moment the group of ordinary guests walked through the door, Michael's stomach dropped. There were 6 of them, 3 men and 3 women, dressed in casual clothes that, to Michael, screamed out of place. One man wore a faded flannel shirt, another a worn-out hoodie, and a woman sported a thrift store jacket that clashed violently with Aurora's pristine aesthetic. Michael's lip curled instinctively, but he caught himself, remembering Keanu's challenge. Serve them properly, respectfully, for 1 hour or lose his job. Keanu, now seated at a central table that Robert had hastily arranged for him, watched Michael with a calm, unreadable expression. The rest of the restaurant watched too, the tension palpable. Vincent and Emily leaned forward in their seats, Vincent still skeptical but intrigued, while Emily's disapproval of Michael had hardened into quiet support for Keanu. Christopher, the silver-haired businessman, sipped his wine, his sharp eyes missing nothing, a faint smile playing on his lips. Michael plastered on a fake smile, his movements jerky as he approached the group. "Good evening," he said, his voice strained, the politeness forced. "Welcome to Aurora. Please follow me to your table." He led them to a prime spot near the center of the dining room, as Keanu had instructed, but his disdain was evident in the way he pulled out their chairs, his gestures sharp and impatient. The group, however, seemed unfazed, chatting amiably as they settled in, their laughter a stark contrast to the hushed whispers of Aurora's elite patrons. When one of the women asked about the risottos, Michael couldn't help himself. "Well," he sneered, "if you have to ask, you probably can't afford either. But the truffle is 70 more because, you know, truffles are a luxury ingredient." The woman blinked, taken aback, but before she could respond, a burly man in a flannel shirt laughed. "Wow. Friendly service," he said. Michael flushed but bit back a retort, remembering the stakes. Emily, watching, leaned toward Vincent. "He's awful," she said. "Those people are just trying to enjoy their meal, and he's treating them like dirt." Vincent shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe," he admitted, "but you've got to admit, they don't exactly fit in here." Emily shook her head. "Fit in? Since when does that matter? They're guests just like us. That waiter needs to learn some manners." Christopher, meanwhile, observed the scene with growing interest, his earlier disapproval hardening into quiet judgment. Disapproval of Michael was now tinged with curiosity about Keanu's intentions. When Michael returned to the table to take the group's order, his attitude hadn't improved. "So, what'll it be?" he asked, his tone clipped, pen hovering over his notepad. The man in the hoodie, a wiry guy with a scruffy beard, grinned. "I'll have the foie gras rossini. 350, right?" His voice carried a hint of mischief. Michael froze, his pen stopping midair. "You're joking," he said flatly. The man raised an eyebrow. "Do I look like I'm joking?" he replied, his tone sharpening. Michael's facade cracked, his voice rose. "Look, let's not waste everyone's time. That dish is for people who actually belong here. Maybe stick to something more affordable, like the salad." The table fell silent. The group exchanged looks, but before anyone could respond, a soft cough came from Keanu's table. Keanu stood, his presence suddenly commanding, and walked over, his movements deliberate. "Problem, Michael?" Keanu asked, his voice calm but carrying quiet authority. Michael whirled around, his face pale. They're not serious," he stammered. "They can't possibly afford—" "Afford what?" Keanu interrupted, his tone sharp. "The same dish I ordered? The one you mocked me for? Or is it that you've decided once again who belongs here and who doesn't?" Michael opened his mouth, but no words came out. Keanu turned to the group, his expression softening. "Your orders are on me tonight," he said warmly. "Order whatever you like." The man in the hoodie grinned wider, leaning back in his chair. "Thanks, Keanu. And by the way, you might want to tell your waiter here to be careful who he insults. I'm John Parker, restaurant critic for Gourmet Insider." The revelation hit Michael like a punch to the gut, his face draining of color. The room buzzed with gasps and whispers. John Parker was notorious for his scathing reviews, capable of making or breaking a restaurant with a single article. Michael's hands trembled, his notepad slipping from his fingers as the reality of his mistakes sank in. The hour passed in a blur of mistakes. Michael misdelivered orders, snapped at the group when they asked for refills, and even spilled a glass of wine on the woman in the denim jacket. His frustration boiled over. When the clock finally struck the end of the hour, Michael stood before Keanu, his head bowed, arrogance shattered. "You failed," Keanu said, firm but not cruel. "You let your biases dictate your actions and disrespected people who deserve better." Michael braced himself, expecting the worst, but Keanu's next words caught him off guard. "I'm not going to fire you," Keanu continued. "Instead, I'm giving you a chance to learn. Starting tomorrow, you'll work at a charity restaurant I run downtown, serving people who, by your standards, don't belong. Do it for a month. If you change, you can come back. If not..." Michael nodded stiffly, throat tight, unable to meet Keanu's gaze. Emily smiled softly, while Vincent, now humbled, nodded in agreement. Christopher raised his wine glass in approval. As the group left, John Parker paused at Keanu's table, grinning. "Nice move, Keanu. Don't worry, my review will be glowing, but that waiter, he's got a lot to learn." Keanu nodded, expression unreadable but eyes quietly satisfied. The night had been a lesson, not just for Michael, but for everyone watching. As the heavy doors of Aurora swung shut behind Keanu Reeves, the restaurant exhaled. Tension faded like the final notes of a symphony. Keanu stepped into the warm Beverly Hills night, his faded jacket blending into the shadows. His departure as unassuming as his arrival. For him, this wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about planting a seed, a lesson in respect that would linger long after he was gone. Inside, conversations resumed in hushed tones. Michael stood stiffly near the kitchen, his face a mask of resentment and confusion. His initial reaction was anger, pride bruised, ego battered. "A charity restaurant? He just wants to humiliate me," Michael muttered under his breath. But as the night wore on, Keanu's words began to sink in. He thought about the group of ordinary guests, John Parker's knowing grin, and his own smugness laid bare. For the first time, he questioned whether he'd been wrong, not just tonight, but every time he'd judged someone by their appearance. At the bar, Vincent and Emily clinked their glasses. "I hope he learned something," Emily said, her earlier frustration softening into quiet hope. Vincent, humbled, nodded. "If he's smart, he will." The night's final surprise came from Christopher, the silver-haired businessman who'd silently supported Keanu. He finished his wine, set the glass down, and approached Robert, the manager. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Reeves about that charity restaurant. I want to fund it." Robert blinked, stunned. "Sir, that's incredibly generous, but Piasi." Christopher smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting a story untold. "Because I was once like those people Michael mocked, a nobody in worn-out clothes, dismissed by people like him. But someone gave me a chance, and now I give back. Tell Michael that when he starts his month there, I'll be watching." Robert nodded, speechless, as Christopher left. His revelation was a quiet thunderclap in the night's aftermath. The restaurant closed, but the lesson lingered, etched into the minds of everyone who witnessed it. Michael, grappling with his pride, faced a choice: learn or lose everything. As Keanu disappeared into the city lights, one thought echoed. In a world full of prejudice, kindness is the only choice. Keanu's story reminds us that true worth lies not in appearances, but in actions. Like Michael, we risk letting biases blind us, judging others by their clothes or status. Respect and kindness are choices we can make every day, transforming strangers into allies and mistakes into growth. In life, it's easy to judge someone at a glance, but true understanding comes from taking a step back and seeing the person, not the appearance. Treat the janitor with the same respect as the CEO. Listen more than you speak. Offer kindness without expecting anything in return. Small actions of empathy can ripple into profound change. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. How can you show more compassion tomorrow? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this message meaningful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more inspiring stories. See you in the next video. Have a wonderful day.